I'd like to introduce our speakers, Michael Herzog of NextB and Stephen Gillespie of Fenwick & West. Michael Herzog is the CEO of NextB, over 25 years of experience in the enterprise software industry, including executive management roles in strategy, product management, marketing, engineering. NextB provides products and services companies actively identify and manage their software assets, including open source, third-party, commercial, and original components so that these companies can gain the benefits of an integrated software supply chain. Stephen Gillespie is a partner at Fenwick & West in the Technology Transactions Group and a co-leader of the firm's open source practice. He provides strategic and legal advice to software, new media, and technology companies. Stephen helps his clients build and protect their value through careful management of legal and intellectual property aspects of their key transactions. He structures, drafts, and negotiates mission-critical agreements, including national and international development and distribution agreements, licenses, strategic alliances, and business process outsourcing transactions. Please join me in welcoming Michael and Stephen.
Thank you, Kristen. This is Stephen Gillespie, again, a partner in the Intellectual Property Group at Fenwick & West, and I'm really pleased to welcome everyone to our seminar on managing software inventories and automating open source software compliance. We thought we would start by just giving a little bit more background specific to open source for each of our speakers, and I'm very pleased to have with me Michael Herzog, who is the CEO of NextB. Michael, do you want to say a little bit about your background in open source?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Stephen. Welcome, everyone. NextB is a relatively small company, but we've been working in the open source area for 10 years, and for the last 7 to 8 years, we've been focusing on open source compliance. And the daily work is often doing what are called audits or analysis of code bases. That's where we get a lot of our expertise. Today, we're talking about another broader perspective on open source compliance, but it's a very interesting area. We just see it exploding exponentially. Literally, the use of open source has gone from roughly 50% of most products we look at to 70, 80, sometimes 95% if it's a new startup. So it's a really exciting area, and we're hoping to help people see it's not that hard to comply. It's really not that hard. You just have to do a few basic things.
Excellent. Thank you, Michael. And I myself have been involved in open source throughout most of my legal career for over the past 20 years, representing technology companies primarily in Silicon Valley. I started out early on advising MySQL with their dual licensing strategy, and then with their sale to Sun Microsystems. I was involved in advising Sun Microsystems in their own open source licensing and bringing Java into open source, and then in the sale of Sun Microsystems to Oracle. I've represented Cisco and Symantec for well over 15 years in developing their own open source compliance strategies, and I continue to represent both of those companies in mergers and acquisitions diligence regarding open source. So when they're buying companies, we do these kind of audits that Michael was referencing. I helped Splunk in their early open source strategy and development. I advised the investors in Hortonworks on their relationship with the Apache Software Foundation and the Hadoop database. I'm currently representing a consortium of 15 large banks who are not known in the open source world in their efforts to establish a new open source foundation, which will eventually open source a large secure communications platform called Symphony. And I continue to do regular open source counseling both for compliance and use and contributions of open source from our many technology clients here at Fenwick & West. So with that introduction, I think we'll just dig straight into it in the seminar. We're going to start by talking about open source compliance generally. In particular, I'd like to address a broad overview of how open source licensing works and why compliance is important. So we'll talk about some of the most common open source license requirements and discuss the key compliance challenges. And then talk about an approach for automating compliance with attribution and redistribution requirements, and demo some of the functionality and features that NextBee has developed to help with that automating process. So first, just a broad outline of how open source licenses work and why compliance is so important. An open source license is an interesting breed that is unique in contract and intellectual property licensing in many ways. A license to use open source is what we call a conditional license. So it's a little different than a contract. It's a statement by the copyright owner, the developer of that open source software, that they will not assert intellectual property rights against you. In other words, they're granting you a license to use that open source, so long as you meet certain conditions to the license, and that's why we call it a conditional license. It's a license granted to all comers on the same terms, conditioned on users' compliance with the specific conditions of the license. And so in order to benefit from that license from the copyright holder, a user is required to meet the conditions of the license to comply. And if you fail to comply with the conditions of the license, it means you're not licensed. It means that you are infringing the copyright owned by that developer. And so the cause of action of an open source contributor or licensor is not in contract. So I'm not saying you breached my contract with you when you failed to comply with the terms of my license. Instead, the cause of action is for infringement of the copyright, because you are now using, copying, distributing, modifying my copyrighted work of authorship without my permission, without a license. Because you've breached the conditions of the license, you're no longer licensed. And so if I want to enforce my open source license against users who aren't complying with the terms, I'm going to sue them for copyright infringement, and I'm going to have all of the remedies available to me at law for copyright infringement, for using, copying, modifying my copyright code without my permission or without a license from me. And so there's some key things that everyone should understand about what that means in practice. It means that you could suffer very significant consequences for failing to comply with the conditions of an open source license. In particular, under the Copyright Act, a copyright holder is entitled to its actual or statutory damages and to injunctive relief. So for each work of open source that you use without complying with the license, I can recover all of your profits as actual damages and all of my losses if I have any, or I can recover statutory damages. And statutory damages under the U.S. Copyright Act are between $750 and $30,000 per work infringed. So oftentimes I could get up to $30,000 per copy that you made of code without complying with the license.
Switch you out to microphone.
Or I could, if your infringement is willful, in other words, if you know that you're distributing my open source code in your product, and you know that you're not complying with the terms of the license, I may be able to prove willful infringement. And if your infringement is willful, I can recover up to $300,000 per infringement. So that is a significant exposure just on the damages side. But even more significant for many of my clients who use open source is injunctive relief. If I'm a copyright holder and I allege that you are distributing my open source in your product and failing to comply with the conditions of my license, I can get a court to stop you from distributing your product. In other words, I can significantly disrupt your operations and profitability through an action for injunctive relief. And so it's very important that everyone who is using open source, and especially distributing it in their products, comply with the conditions of the license. And so we're going to move next to a discussion about how to implement a successful compliance strategy so that you can comply with these various obligations and conditions. In particular, we'll be talking about the most common obligations and conditions and how a successful strategy works. So digging into that, obviously, in order to have a successful compliance strategy, you have to know what open source you're using, what open source components, and what are the terms of the license. And so a successful inventory is the starting place for any successful compliance strategy in open source. And that's really the key focus here today is how do you make sure you have a right inventory? How do you know what are the obligations under each of the open source licenses that you are using? And how can you automate that process to make it as frictionless as possible? So segueing now, unless, Michael, do you want to add anything to the above?
No.
Great. Segueing now to some sort of what are the most common license obligations or conditions to these licenses. They range from relatively light to relatively heavy commitments that you make when you decide to use open source. The list starts with copyright notices and license notices and attribution obligations where you're obligated under most open source licenses at a minimum to include a copyright notice or a notice with your code that says, I'm using code that was licensed to me by the Apache Software Foundation or by some other open source licensor. And they get more complex in various ways in certain of the open source licenses that we call Copyleft licenses, where you might have to deliver source code either for the code that you have modified or in some cases for your own proprietary code that you have linked to open source code. And so those obligations become more complex and they need to be addressed very carefully. There's often obligations that you notify users of any changes you made to the open source code. And finally, there are certain indemnities and trademark issues in some of the open source licenses, and you need to be aware of those. Starting first with attribution obligations, because I think this is the most significant set of obligations with respect to the vast majority of open source licenses. And in some ways, they're the easiest to comply with because all you have to do is give the appropriate attributions and notices. But in other ways, they're the most difficult because there's so many of them. When you have a code base of many, many open source projects that you've used in your own product and you're distributing that, you have a large number of attributions that you have to track and that you have to comply with. These requirements are fairly simple, but I'd like to just share with you some examples of how these actually read in the license agreement. I would encourage everybody who is involved in assessing open source compliance to go to a website called opensource.org, where you can find copies of all of the licenses and a broad range of materials about open source licensing generally. But if you are on that site and you pull up, as an example, one of the most common licenses in open source, the Apache license version 2.0. This is from the Apache Software Foundation. It's a very well-drafted open source license, and it's very succinct and clearly written. But in Section 4 there, you find a clause called Redistribution, and it says simply you can redistribute copies of the work that's licensed here, quote, provided that you meet the following conditions, end quote. And this is what I mean by a conditional license. You have a license to redistribute the work as modified by you, and you have a condition that you have to meet in order to benefit from that license. And here are the examples of the conditions. You have to give any other recipient of the work a copy of this license. So it literally requires you, if you're going to redistribute a product that includes any software licensed under this Apache license, that you give all recipients a copy of the license. Number 2, you have to cause any modified files to carry prominent notices stating that you changed the files. So if you're going to go into the code base that you received under an Apache license and make changes, you have to notate those changes in the source code itself. Item 3, you must retain in the source form all copyright, patent, trademark, and attribution notices. So one of the key requirements is don't modify copyright notices in the code that you receive. And number 4, and this is really the important one for your compliance obligations, if the work includes a notice text file, then you have to include a readable copy of the attribution notices contained within such notice file, and place them, either in the documentation for your code, or if you have some sort of interactive UI for your code base, and you include license text in there, you have to include the attribution notices there. So that's an example, very prominent example in the Apache license of these kind of attribution requirements. What that means, and very often we will have a product that we're doing an audit of or assessing where engineers have taken all of this free code that is freely available for use under this license and repurposed it in a given software product. And so for many software products, we will see 300 plus open source licenses in the bill of materials. And Michael will tell us a little bit more about how you audit and know what is there and how you generate your compliance with respect to those 300 pieces of code. But many of them will be under Apache, and for each of them, you're going to have to figure out a way to meet these conditions to the license. You have to provide a copy of the license, and you have to give the appropriate attributions to say, this code includes software licensed to me by the Apache Software Foundation, etc. Question from the audience?
How is this supposed to work when you're distributing compiled binary packages of an open source project?
So if you're distributing binary code that includes open source, then you'll need to distribute with your documentation or in some other form the various attributions that are required. Michael, do you want to pick that up?
Yes. So basically, there is a variety of rules. Some licenses are very specific, some are general, but the general rule would be documentation. A lot of the precedent for this was some time ago, so it was considered the easiest way to do it. A generally good practice, what we would recommend to people is if you have a product with a UI, you put it in an about page, or that's considered the friendliest way to do it. And if you did it that way, I doubt any author, open source author, would object. That's a form of documentation. That's the principle. One of the key things that Steven's bringing up and is so central to all this is attribution is the heart of open source. The principle of open source is the one thing I'm doing is I'm giving you the software, and you should not pretend you wrote it, and you should give me credit. And a lot of people miss some of those elements. So if you put it out there in a reasonably prominent place on a about screen, it doesn't have to be at the top, but it can be that would be the preferable place to put it. Secondarily, it could be in documentation. If the product doesn't have any UI, then obviously the documentation goes as the option you're stuck with.
But I don't necessarily have to include the license text in some binary file that I'm distributing.
No, you do not.
Yeah, and on this slide that is currently on the screen, you'll see that one way you can comply with your notice obligations and attribution obligations is by delivering the source code. So if I just deliver to my end users a copy of the source code, the notices are typically baked into that distribution package. And so if I'm distributing a Linux kernel or some part of LGPL code, I will very often just deliver with the binaries a copy of the source. If I'm not doing that and I'm delivering just binaries, then I need to create notice files and include them in some way, either electronically or in my documentation, my printed documentation. Notices under most of these licenses are required to be in the product delivery. And so very often we get a question from our clients, can't I just put the notices on a website and include with my product a redirect or some kind of link or even just a printed URL where the end users can find my attributions. That is a very common, but it's not 100% compliance with the obligations under the licenses, so posting on a website is usually not sufficient for full compliance. Also, relying on third-party notices is usually not sufficient. So very often we'll have a product that includes in-licensed code from a third party. So maybe I've got a Broadcom chip on my appliance. And that Broadcom chip may well have been based on a Linux kernel and have some other open source embedded in it. I might have received from Broadcom their disclosures, but I'm going to need to make sure that I've fully disclosed all the third-party code with my product, including the third-party code that I received from Broadcom. Not meaning to single out Broadcom if anybody is here from Broadcom. But that's just an example that comes up very frequently. And it also highlights in your compliance inventory a particularly important issue, which is as I receive third-party code, even under a commercial license, I need to diligence and make sure I understand what open source components are included in that so that I can meet my compliance obligations. And so that's another auditing and inventory building requirement.
And just on that point, in general, these days, almost everything you're going to get, with a very few exceptions, like super low-level firmware and some things like that, just about everybody's product has some in it, whether they know it or not. So the assertion that, no, we don't use any open source, even in a Microsoft environment, is just not plausible anymore. You want some evidence from your supplier.
So we've talked about attribution requirements, and again, those are in almost all open source licenses, and that's why they're particularly important to focus on. Some of the licenses also include source code redistribution obligations. So these licenses are the general public license, the LGPL or lesser general public license, also the Affero general public license, and some other licenses that we call copyleft. There's two types of copyleft. There's what we call weak copyleft and strong copyleft. The weak copyleft licenses, like the Mozilla public license, say only that if you modify code within the file that you received from me under that license, if you add code or change code, then you need to make the source code for that modified file available to your end recipients in a redistribution. That's similar to the LGPL, the lesser general public license, that, again, it's focused on modifications I made to the LGPL code itself. Stronger copyleft licenses also have a concept of a broader work. So if I have a derivative work of the GPL code, or if I have a broader work that includes my own proprietary code and GPL code, and they're linked together in some sort of intimate way or compiled together in a single executable, then I might have to make the source code available for that combined work. And those are some of the more complex issues from an engineering perspective to sort out whether two works are separate in an aggregate and just communicating together in an arm's length way, or are they combined to become a derivative or a work based on the program under GPL?
Yeah, I had two comments on that. One is the GPL and the LGPL and the derivatives are in a class of their own. So although the LGPL is often called a weak copyleft, or we call it copyleft limited, it has a number of very specific requirements about how software components are put together, how they interact and link, which most of the others do not. So you can't create a dependency, you can't modify code and create a dependency on code you're not going to deliver. So there's actually a requirement that you must be able to compile the source code. So it gets a bit more complicated. That's just one thing, that those two are in a class of their own, whatever the version. In general, the other key point is people get confused between offering the source code and publicly, advertising the source code. So your obligation in all cases is to offer a recipient of the binary a copy of the source code. So many companies do post it on the web just for anyone to see, and that's a practice
most open source projects appreciate and applaud. But technically, the requirement is you need to be able to respond if one of your recipients requests it. So who your recipients are is pretty important to thinking about how you're going to organize this. If you're in a business-to-business only scenario, there's different kinds of risks than if you're in a business-to-consumer scenario, right? It's a specific thing that gets lost. You must offer it, and then if the offer is made and someone asks for it and you're not prepared to deliver, that's where a lot of the cases have come up in the last 10 years when the company wasn't able to produce that software. But you were not required to post it or to make it public in the sense of anybody. It has to be available to a recipient of the binaries.
Yeah, and what most of my clients have done, especially over the last few years, is just have a website where they post the source code for the materials that they are obligated to provide, because it's just easy to point users to that source code, and it gives you an internal mechanism for updating the source code and keeping that current and making it available. It's not required under the license, but it is a recognized and effective way to make the code available.
And in the open source world, a lot of it's about reputation. You comply as a company, a lot of the damage is to your reputation. And the same thing applies here. If you're active and proactive in contributing back to the community, that's always seen as a positive, but it's not a requirement. Did you have a question?
If you're using the GPL license and there's a component that's sort of moving to underlying proprietary code, and you think that the component maybe has to be released out, but you're not sure, how do you sort of approach that? Because the engineers will create it in such a way that they think it's like static linking versus dynamic, and so, it's just kind of figuring out what to do in that situation.
So the question was what do you do when you think you have a situation where you have open source code under a copyleft obligation linked in some way with proprietary code? To quote many attorneys I know and are friends with, it all depends. So it is actually a case where you need both technical and legal advice. We do the technical work all the time. We did a bunch of it yesterday. But we produce fact patterns, if you will, to say this is how the things connect, but there is no absolute understanding. So it would absolutely have to be in the context of how your legal counsel looks at it. There is if you're into this stuff, there's something called Linux, loadable kernel modules in Linux, LKMs, and there are many, many different opinions about whether you can have a proprietary LKM. So there is no correct answer. What you need to have is a well-reasoned policy and then follow that policy. So, I'd be glad to talk to people later about these kinds of things and how we approach them, but ultimately it's a matter of applying a legal policy, how you deal with that.
Yeah. One thing Michael mentioned, and it's in the last bullet on the current slide, is that it's not just the code that you have modified for many of these licenses. It's also the code that's necessary to enable an end user to recompile and reintegrate that code. And so if you think about an LGPL library that you might have made some changes to and then integrated into your larger product, if that's a DLL, like a separate library that operates largely independently, you would want to make sure that you were going to distribute the source code for your changes for that library, but you would also want to make sure that you distributed enough information to enable somebody who is an end user to exercise their rights under the LGPL to take that code and make their own changes or improvements to it, and then to reintegrate it and have it all work together.
So that is a particular requirement, again, of GPL and LGPL, not all the others in copyleft limited category. And it's also just for reference, most of this terminology and precedent came up out of C, C++, those types of languages. There's another whole layer of discussion about what it means in Java. And the very interesting one now is what does it mean in JavaScript? So if you combine as many people do, many JavaScript files into one executable file. Obviously, they are tied together. But what does it mean to run JavaScript in the same VM or the same environment? Is that interaction or not? There isn't much clear about that. So it's becoming more complicated, but we do have a background of how this was done in the early days, and it's evolving to newer languages and newer technologies.
Slight technical.
Another important obligation under the open source licenses that everyone should be aware of in developing a compliance program is how use of the open source impacts your own end user license terms and what you need to have in your end user license agreement or commercial agreements for distributing a product that includes open source. And so for some of the licenses, it is necessary to specifically carve out the open source licensing requirements from your end user license agreement. So again, on the continuum, there are permissive licenses like MIT and BSD and Apache. On those permissive licenses, say you can distribute a product that includes that code under the terms of your own license, and you don't need to worry about changing your license to address those other than making sure you have met your attribution obligations. There are, however, some licenses that say you have to have specific language in your end user license agreement to address the obligations under the open source license. So the LGPL, for example, says that your end user license has to permit your end users to reverse engineer and debug their own modifications. So if you have a restriction in your end user license agreement against reverse engineering, in order to be fully compliant with the LGPL, you have to have a little carve out for except to modify LGPL components and to debug. Similarly, GPL and LGPL licenses can't be changed. The code has to be distributed under the terms of those licenses. And so it is necessary to say in your license that this software is distributed with certain open source software that is licensed under the GPL, and that the GPL will apply to that component.
And one other comment on that is we see some licenses is, again, you want to think ahead. So, if you want, this might be a case where you would use some other external reference to say we include, use general language that this product may include third-party and open source, and you can go here to get the list or something like that. That's a little different than the product delivery. But I've seen people put together licenses where they embed the exact state of today in there, and maintaining that inside a license agreement would be pretty bad news. So at least an exhibit or something. Don't just put it in the body.
So those are the primary obligations for compliance with open source. There are others, like don't use our trademarks to promote or suggest that we are endorsing your product. There's various others, but those are the broad categories. And so what we'd like to do now is segue into talking about, once you know you're using open source and you're going to develop a compliance strategy, what are some of the key compliance and automation challenges for developing that strategy? And I'll let Michael start through that.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. I think we teed up quite a few of the issues. So the gorilla in the room we're not discussing today is scanning, or how you make your inventory, and we do that all day long, so we know that's involved. But what we're trying to do is get people to think ahead about what do you do once you have information about what's in your software. How do you manage it? Because what we see a lot is people do various techniques to find the information, and then it sits in a document or a spreadsheet or something. It's not actionable. So there's two elements to this process that are very critical, and we use certain terminology. One is what we call an inventory. So the idea of an inventory, and this is not standard terminology, but hopefully it will be, is that I have a development system. So when I think of a development system, if I use Oracle database and my customer installs the vanilla version, that's not really my environment. The environment is my software, libraries that might come from a third party or open source that I embed, tools, that sort of thing. And that's usually fairly large. You have a version control system, but you need to start there. You need to know what's in that development environment, and it's, usually versioned, release to release. Could be many products built from one development environment, or you could have 10 different development environments, and that'll come up later. And then secondly, we use a somewhat more narrow definition of a bill of materials to represent what is actually distributed with your product. So typically, we do these things all the time, and we focus a lot on making sure we know not just what's in use, but what's delivered, because most of your open source obligations apply to what you deliver. Unlike commercial software, if you just use it internally and it never leaves your development environment, there's usually no external obligation. There's some very rare exceptions. If you want to use a development tool for Microsoft, you pay for it, whatever you do with it. But open source is a bit different. So it is very important to know. And the good news is what you typically are releasing is some subset. There's old code, there's new code, there's code for different products. So you have to have both those ideas in mind. And so your obligations are really for your product releases, not for just the large mass of software that you're working with at any point in time. So that's a pretty important concept that's not always clear to people who haven't worked in this area.
Yeah, I might just add to that. When we're doing an audit of open source for an acquisition, we will often have a third party like NextBee scan the code base and deliver to us a bill of materials that says, here are all of the third-party components, both open source and commercial, that are in the code base we received. And that is really key because the code base that we receive may include a lot of third-party components that are in the source code repository, but are not in the distributed software of the target that we're analyzing. And so we really need to parse that to understand what ends up in the build and gets distributed so that we can focus on those and complying with the material open source obligations with respect to what gets distributed. And so we spend quite a lot of time working with the third-party auditor and the target engineers to understand exactly how they're going to build the distributed software and what third-party components they're going to pull into the build for that distribution.
Yeah, so there's a number of things that come up there. The one key example is if you're in a working Linux environment, you use something usually called the GCC tool chain or the GNU tool chain, which is a whole set of development tools. Over time, a large number of those tools are now become licensed under what's called the GPL v3. And most commercial companies find that to be fairly toxic for its own discussion. But it has been organized such that you're not needing to, if you use the tool chain, you really don't need to redistribute any of those GPL3 components. They're really designed for the internal use. I mean, you could accidentally deliver them, but there's a whole series of very, very important pieces of software, and it's critical whether that's, something that you are using yourself or you are delivering. The other big area that's just exploding, we have another talk we do about GitHub and the explosion there, but one of the things that's going on these days that's getting a little out of control in the Java web environment is what's called dependencies. So there's lots of cases now where people use pre-built libraries. I mean, there might be 100 of them under Apache 2.0, and they're really not a problem from any copyleft perspective, but there's lots of them, and they may pull them from a repository there's a public version of Maven, and they may pull them, and you may not really know what you're distributing. So you really have to understand, again, what's going into my product. There's many systems. There's configuration files that you can build your product. If you have internet access out of your development environment, it can go pull these libraries in, and you never had a copy on your premises. Not necessarily the best practice, but it can work, but you have to know that's happening. So the whole thing here is what is actually in the product as delivered. If I have to redistribute source code, it's what the recipient received, not everything that I might have back in the office. Yes?
So if the distribution does not contain these third-party sources or binaries at all, but in order to install that distribution on a client's machine or a runtime, as a part of the package installation procedure by some package management system or something, it goes and manually installs all of those dependencies because they're defined somewhere. Does that mean that all of those open source licenses we must be compliant with those within the distribution?
It depends. And we've been through these cases recently because developers will say, well, I know our policy is we can't redistribute it. What can we do? So you have to think through. Some Open source authors might consider that to be trying to circumvent the rules, but it really is a policy and legal question, and it also depends who's doing it. So, for instance, if the customer does it themselves, my understanding that's a little different than you send in your people to do it. So there's a number of agency issues, too.
Yeah, and there is something of the spirit and intent that is important to consider here. Even if, as a strict legal matter, you may not be distributing the open source code and therefore subject to your obligations, it can be a pretty negative PR hit to your company if you're really working hard to circumvent your obligations under open source licenses. There are some legal theories under which you could be held liable for failure to comply with the open source licenses, even in that instance where the software is not distributed by you but is pulled into your package on installation. And some of those are complicated, but there are some legal theories, especially if you have any header files or if in your code itself it is specifically has instructions where to pull from and what to pull in, you might be distributing copyrighted code or, even infringing somebody's patents. There's various ways that open source licensors have thought of to prevent that kind of circumvention of the intent here, which is really to make sure that you're telling people what third-party code you're using, you're dependent on, and giving them appropriate attribution so that, they can fulfill their mission in having contributed that code for your use for free.
Yeah, so we had a very recent case where a company ran on CentOS, Linux, and as a convenience to their customers, they provided a package of, I can't remember, there's lots of them, lots of RPMs, package modules, for extra packages that you need to run their product, so they're not part of the core distribution. And they provided them as a separate package to customers on the theory that some customers won't let their servers access the internet, which may be true. But then they're distributing that. So you really got to think through what those are. The other big gotcha that we run into is mix and match. So in the MySQL world under Oracle, there's a commercial version and there's an open source version. You cannot mix and match. You can't use the open source connector with the commercial database. You can't use the commercial database with the open source connector. Some developers say, well, my customer will buy the Oracle license. I'll just ship the connector. Well, nope, you got to ship the commercial connector, which I don't know what the fee is. So it's an area where having a policy and a position makes sense, and someone has to have a rational theory about why it's okay. I guess that's the way to think about it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So let me dig in a little more. Again, I mentioned earlier that the amount of open source is growing well beyond 50% in most products that we see. This slide is just trying to remind people of the challenges. The software is coming from open source. In the big picture, you don't want to lose track of commercial third-party packages. You may be obliged to pay royalties, or there may be other rules associated with those licenses. You want to be in compliance. You may have outsourced code development. And then there's another area which comes in under free and open source, FOSS, or FLOSS is the acronym, which is free but not open source. And usually doesn't have attribution obligations, but has other obligations. So the most classic case is the Oracle Java runtime environment, which you can use for free, but you can't use it on certain kinds of devices. So you do have to follow it. So there's all these things going on. There is a lot of different activities we're seeing. And one of the things is a lot more emphasis on customers asking suppliers for the information. It's really, really critical to have something in place that you ask for that and insist on it. Okay. So one thing I just want to mention, typically this kind of communication has gone on with a spreadsheet, some document. A company may provide the attribution documentation. But if you're actually going to comply, an attribution documentation, which is typically a Word document, is actually not very convenient. You need something that's, ingestible data. There is again, a separate topic. There is a project called SPDX from the Linux Foundation, which is coming up with a very comprehensive format for large companies to exchange data. I'll be glad to talk to you about that later. That's just coming out. It's version 2 and is going to take off. But basically, these days, what you're going to need is this bill of materials, usually envisioned as some kind of database or tabular format. The notices and the source code redistribution packages. So it is very common for very for well-educated suppliers to provide this to their customers. So, for instance, if you go to a TiVo box and you go to look up the data, you'll see that TiVo has their list of things, and then they have a section that says, and we got these things from Adobe, and we got these things from someone else. So that's a very clean way to do it. I was handed these on, but you inherit those obligations. There's no reason you can't say I inherited them from this other company, but you inherit all those obligations. So again, what we're talking about next is how to manage all this data as opposed to acquire it. So you need somewhere to store it. There are a lot of issues about validating what's incoming. So this SPDX project has a lot of interesting ideas there. And how are you going to update it? So, an audit or an analysis at some point in time, you've got to figure out some strategy for keeping that up to date. So what we've seen in our practice is there's really two levels of the solution, at least two levels. One is tooling at an engineering group level. And some companies use only one technology, but most companies use multiple technologies. See, there is no one solution that says, I'll do it exactly this way, because you've got the language, you've got the development environment, development tools, you got the build tools, you got a whole series of specific choices made to make a product effective. You need something that adapts to that. So in a little while, I'm going to demonstrate a kind of a general purpose tool we've come up with. And that's really designed to make sure each engineering group has a solution because they're closest to the code. They're the ones who are going to know what's in their code. They may not understand licenses very well, but they know what the code is. And also, they're the ones who are dealing with the day-to-day. And the second side of it is a much higher level, which is a system, if you've got more than one product, to pull that data together and essentially harmonize it or normalize it so that you can look at components and licenses without worrying about the underlying technical details, right? So if you're in a legal position or a business position with multiple products, you don't want to have to understand the underlying details of each environment. You need something that's harmonized across those different development tools. So basically, we came up. What I'm going to talk about, and this is kind of the practical side of it. We have two solutions and more in the background, but the first one I'm going to talk about is called About Code. And About Code is an open source project under the Apache 2.0 license. And what this is a simple system. The idea came from working with developers who do similar things. We have not seen a commercial system exactly for this, but it's been some certain development teams have done, where you embed the information in the database, in the code base. So it's basically a way, and I'll show you some examples of it, is where you put simply text files, a certain kind of text file that can then be read by certain interpreters into the code base. And obviously, to keep that up to date, someone would have to know how that works. But it's similar to the kinds of things that developers do with configuration files, right? They'll have depending on their technology, they'll have various files, or they'll have README instructions that say, when you want to compile this thing, do this and this and this. So it's not out of their realm of thinking. And the most powerful value to that is integrated into the build system, so that you actually could produce not just information about what's in your development code base, but what is, as you build the product, you can just capture, you can sort of grab the files that are relevant to anything that's in my end product, package it up at the end. And we have several customers we worked with who've done this, but it's the good and the bad is it's always fairly specific to how they do builds. And if you're involved in development, there's a little bit of the magic and a lot of customization on build systems, so someone has to own that. But that's one dimension. And then the second one is we call Deja Code. This is a software subscription product, and it's designed to work at the other end. So basic idea is you can bring in this data, and I'll show you what it looks like. From an audit, it doesn't really matter what the tool was. Typically what you're bringing in is the component, the license, the owner, the copyright, download URL. Metadata is what people usually call that, which is insensitive to the technology. You organize it under a product tree, and then you can both keep a system of record for all these releases. You could produce documentation for an old release or a new release, whereas the product team, again, no matter what you say, the product team is going to focus on the current and the next release. If something came up and you had a problem with the open source documentation 2 releases back, getting an engineer to focus on that, getting an engineering manager to focus their people on that is practically impossible. So you have to sort of think of a two-phase approach. So again, this is pretty simple. Most of the information is at the website. It's written in Python. This is not an end-user tool. I mean, a person who does release engineering or scripting could do it, but it's not intended. It doesn't have a GUI. It's intended to be something that can be run with the various kinds of build tools and command line tools that developers use. I'm always interested why we're buying these expensive MacBooks for our developers who only look at green screens all day long, but that's the way it is, so we do it. So this is the website. And here's an example of what a file would look like. So this is the Apache HTTP server. And this is just an example of the kind of information you can put in there. The spec and the layout is designed. You can define custom fields. I mean, it's very flexible because essentially it's a text file with a label, a value, that sort of thing. So this is pretty typical of the kind of information that we would capture. And then what can you do? Well, so we have a set of utilities. One is I can take a spreadsheet and I can create these files inside the code base. So if I've done an audit, I can put the initial data in there. I can pull that data back out. But usually the most interesting thing is I can generate the actual attribution notices from that process. So I can run a script. Again, it is a script, so I'm not going to make you watch me do scripts. But basically, you run a script, we have a template, you get an output, it's ready to go in your GUI. We default to HTML, but it's ready to go into your GUI, or you could print it, or whatever you want to do. And then on the source code redistribution side, you can generate a list of what needs to be redistributed. As we were discussing earlier, there may be other requirements. So, for instance, you may end up distributing a tool chain to help someone compile source code, that's related to Linux. So that has been automated. We've seen people do it, but that's much trickier to come up with something general purpose. So I think, so this is just quickly, this is kind of the idea. You start somewhere with a baseline. You bring in essentially a CSV. You create the about files. You do need to figure out how they're going to get updated. They could be, updated by audits and replacement, or they could be updated by training the developers. The next release, you can produce all the deliverables. So for your customer, they probably do want to get a spreadsheet with a list of everything in there so they can see what it is. They want to get the attribution notices to just, slot into their attribution notices. And if there's source code that needs to be provided, they want to be sure they already have it before they get a request. So I think I'm at the point where we switch over.
Okay. So I need some Alt-Tab will work. Okay. So here we are.
I was just going to say, Michael's going to show you how it works.
Yeah. So, where is my tab? All right. Sorry, I need one more. So, I had the tab open, but I lost it. So this is on GitHub, and this is where the code is, and this is where the instructions are, and so on. And so we have an example here. E2FS Progs is a very, very well-known package of file system utilities. It's been around forever. And we picked this one because it has some kind of interesting licensing within it. So this is an example of what you would need to create the about code. So here, can people see? Yeah, okay, screen. So basically, what you've got is primarily a spreadsheet, a CSV, and it has certain information that would typically come from an audit. The most important things being the component, the version, the type of license, the license, and so on. You'll see a reference to something here called DJE license. That's our license library, which we use for convenience, and there's a public version and some additional flags. So it's basically a spreadsheet. And in addition to that, there is a template. So this is an HTML template. It's done in something, a templating language called Jinja. So it actually, you can program it for formatting and so on. It's yet another open source tool, but you have flexibility about how you want to present. And then you have a mapping config file, and there's a lot of text, but basically the mapping config file says what are the fields I'm going to include in the about code. And so the process is you input your CSV or your input file, and it generates, in this case, what you have here, what we're looking at here, is the code structure, the code folder structure of this package. We didn't insert it into the actual package, but this is, for instance, what you'll see at
the top level. So here is the notice from the esteemed author of E2FS Progs, Theodore Tso, and he's got some information in a notice file that he wants to share. We have various structures here. So here's a directory of the main libraries. And you can just see almost visually here that this particular one's under LGPL 2.1, and this one is under the Kerberos license. I mean, what we're doing here is we're putting the license text in place, and then that's referred to here, the license text file, Kerberos.license. So we use our own tool, DejaCode, to grab text and put it in the code base, but you want to have it all in place. So you basically have an about file that has the characteristics. If there's a chunk of notice text, you just copy the notice text, or if there's an already existing notice file, you just point to it. In other words, if the project already had a notice file, just point to the existing notice file. If there's already a copying file for GPL, you just use that. So it's not it's not a user-friendly process in the sense you would want to do this by hand, but it's well automated. And basically, here's the the punchline. Is the output, and it's an HTML file. Let me show. So this is what we actually create, which is a fairly complex file which has a table of contents and so on in it. This is the actual output. But what you want to see is this. This is what it looks like. So this Starship Stargazer is just, a makeup thing. So the way we've organized it is we typically recommend attribution by component. So, for each component, you have an entry. So the way we do this, we give you a set of summary table of contents and then the data below. So I can just click on the link, and again, I see that top statement from Mr. So. Or if I want to dig down into something, I can, let's find, under block ID. So then the template has this component is licensed under GPL. We have copyright notices. And in the case of the large licenses like GPL, Apache, it's pretty irritating to see them replicated in full. So, for instance, if you go on your Android phone and you look it up, they will repeat that full text every time there's a different copyright date and a different, from the Apache Foundation. It's pretty annoying. So, technically that's fine. But part of this whole idea is make it easy for your customers, show you're trying to do it. So we've built in some logic that can detect those licenses, and at the very end we'll have to detect. One of the key things about attribution here is copyright. We see all the time people say, this is licensed under LGPL 2.0 and do not mention the author. That's not attribution. Attribution is give credit to the author. That's the whole idea of open source is give credit to the author. So it's one of those things that kind of sneaks in if you don't have a pretty well-organized plan. People say, I know what the license is. I'm not going to worry about who the copyright holder is. On the other hand, you can get too detailed. I think, certainly most of the legal counsel we work with say, if you summarize you have 20 files with different dates in them and the same copyright holder, making an entry at a higher level in the directory is fine. So one of the characteristics of about code in our process is we try to put the information at the highest level possible. In other words, if all the files in the directory have the same copyright person or company, maybe different dates, and the same license, we just do one entry. It does not make sense to have 20 entries. And that's a long story, again, about scanning and analyzing. But this is an example of what something we think is pretty powerful looks like. The internals of this are a little on the geeky side, but it gives you something very clear. Someone can read this. You've met your obligations. Obviously, you have to determine what they are. In this case, we're doing the package as it exists. And it's very, very helpful because this one has a whole range of different licenses. You can't, overall, if you had to pick one, you'd say it's GPL 2.0 because that's the most restricted in the bunch. But that's clearly not the overall license for everything. There's lots of different pieces. So I just wondered if there are any questions or comments on that at this point.
I might just say that every week at Fenwick and West, I get 2 or 3 requests from companies at various stages for help in complying with their open source licenses and developing an open source compliance strategy. And then what do we put in our attributions? Who's going to track that? How is it going to be written down? And what do we actually do in our end user license agreement and with our product documentation? And it's a very time-consuming and cumbersome process to gather the inventory and then to do the attributions correctly and then to keep them up to date as you have new product releases. And, my bigger, more sophisticated public company clients like Symantec and Cisco have huge teams of people who are doing this routinely, and even sometimes they don't get it entirely right. It's just very cumbersome. But a lot of the early-stage companies don't have the engineering resources and bureaucracy to keep these things going, and they find it very cumbersome. So what Michael has just described and the work that NextBee is doing is really the next level of evolution in automating these processes and removing friction and making this something that people can do easily and more routinely.
And I think a key point I want to make, too, is in terms of practicality. So not a legal concept, but effort counts. So in the open source community, if you're trying to do this right and you miss one, someone may send you a bug notice, but you're not going to get flamed and you're not going to get sued. I mean, the problem is not even trying. That's the first thing. Or just being so wildly out of whack, right, from what someone can see in the product. A second thing is people overestimate the effort, because what most often we end up doing for customers until we can get them on a system like this is we're constantly re-auditing the same code. And everyone uses the word audit, so we use the word audit, but usually it's a baseline analysis. If you embed a basic system and you train somebody in development, I'm not saying every development, maybe it's a release engineer or a QA person, that seems to be the people who have a similar job description, to get most of it, then you can have a periodic audit at a vastly lower level of effort. I mean, so it's not perfection. You're not going to have a core dump and expose your whole company to some worm from some country we don't want it from. So, you need to take that into account, and it's about getting it substantially right and having reasonable processes. Over time, the amount of change, release 1.2.3, 1.2.4, 1.2.5, there's not that much going on usually. I mean, you have to have a system for, it's a whole different discussion about policy and understanding what's coming in, but there's not those huge changes. Obviously, if you change your platform or it's a major release, you look at it differently. So the basics aren't that hard if you get started and you figure out who's responsible for reasonable updating, and then do a periodic audit, just like you would for financial books, right? I mean, but what we see today is most people are not auditing. They're redoing the whole process over and over again because they don't get a baseline and they don't make an attempt to keep it up to date. We don't expect the engineers to be perfect. It's not their core, but there are people either by job title and sometimes by temperament or interest. It actually does occur. There's actually, we see this in some companies, and there's actually volunteers say, I really like this open source stuff. I'd like to figure out what's going on and what we can do. So this is a kind of a system, again, that can be used in any environment. Now, some environments like Java, where you have Maven, you can get commercial versions where they have done a pretty good job of this licensing material. This is really shines in the C++. Actually, we have a lot of customers using with Microsoft code because that's kind of new in the open source, and most of them don't understand how much open source they have already. So, but this is a fallback. If there's already a sophisticated system in place, particularly for a newer technology, use that. We're not suggesting this is for everyone. It's a tool that can be used anywhere. I lost our place here just a second. Oh, there we are. Okay. So, again, this piece in the middle, updating the about files, that's not trivial. You have a question?
Yeah, quick question. A lot of the clients that I work with are using open source components that are, like you mentioned, JavaScript, PHP, Perl, Ruby on Rails, Python, a lot of these scripting languages. They're doing web apps or those kinds of services. How do these tools work with those kinds of code bases, and are you able to do the auditing, the notice file creation, also separate contamination, linking, that kind of stuff as it arises in scripting languages?
Well, we certainly audit this. So the question was how does this apply to the web-oriented languages, JavaScript, PHP, and others? This particular technique works fine there. The auditing techniques are a little different. But this can work as well there because it's they're basically fairly flat structures. They're text type editing of code. The interesting area is Java, Ruby in particular, where there's a huge number of pre-built libraries that are provisioned through a mechanism unique to that library, and Node has its own now, and others. So in those cases, first thing to do is look at what you can get from that system. All of them provide places to put licenses, just like GitHub provides a place to put licenses. The problem is the data is not usually there. But the system exists, so it's a matter of using the system and adding the data. But the point would be, we would strongly recommend using the system that's best suited to the environment. Go has about 3 different ones. So pick one, and that can integrate with the developers and just apply the same principle. If it can do the same thing, then there's no need to use a generic solution if there's a specific solution. And again, those are things, you can contact me or our company separately. We talk about that kind of stuff all the time on the technical side. So I was just going to say here, this is the magic occurs here. Someone has to decide how you're going to keep this data up to date, but that doesn't mean it's that hard, and you can literally edit these in place whenever there's a change. So the next side is sort of jumping up 50,000 feet. Oh, we went through this demonstration. So Deja code is a completely different view, and this is our commercial product, and it's a database, essentially. It's a database about components and licenses and where you would store information. It would not have a copy of the code. There's no code here. It's information about the code, and it's intended to be shared by business, legal, and engineering. So the idea is, engineering here would be engineering director or product manager or someone. It's not a build system. It's once you've got the data, how do I keep it in one place and let engineering move on to the next activity? And so basically, I'm going to focus on my demo on what's called product portfolio, but that's basically where you create a record for your product, the components in it, and the licenses that go with them. And that's kind of where, the magic occurs. So just to describe some terms, the component catalog there's 2 pieces to that. There's a public catalog, so we provide the data about open source projects or anything that's public. But we obviously aren't going to have information about products you bought from another company or that you built yourself or something like that. So you can add your own components. We provide the open source components. Licenses is kind of similar. We have a library of licenses, and we've decomposed them into the major sets of terms. This is a starting point for your legal department. We don't have any policy as NextB. It's a place where you can apply your policy. But the idea is you apply your policies to licenses. You may, your basic policies are, we'll use anything under this license. We'll never use anything under this license. There's a chunk in between. But we find people save a huge amount of time by narrowing the 100% down to the 20% that's in between. We're never going to use that, and this is just about always okay. So that's the idea. And then that may be component specific. So you may have a component that's in the yellow zone and saying, but someone's gone through the analysis and said, we've fit it, and if you use it in this way, you use it as an unmodified library under LGPL v3, then that's an okay use, but you can't do it any other way. Now, obviously, that's on the honor system, but that communicates to developers right away what the rules are. They don't waste time, trying to work around the process. So this is, let me just run in here and, I'll tell you what I'm going to demo and then I'll demo. So I'm just going to look through the main thing is I'm going to talk about the product portfolio and the attribution notice generation. This is all based on work that's underneath, right? So the components are preloaded, the licenses are preloaded over time, and we've already created the product. But you'll see something very similar, but very different. So let me... So this is our product. Again, the product portfolio, the component catalog, license library, and over on tools we have a reporting system and a request system. But basically, we've come up with a product, for demonstration called the Starship Widget Framework. This little icon here tells you that there's a hierarchy, that there's subcomponents. And overall, this license is your commercial license. Primary language is Java. And if you click on this piece of it, what we display is a hierarchy of what's contained. So these are the first-level children. And the little caret means there's basically one license. Primary means you've picked a license. So one of the things we haven't gotten into today is license choices and making those. In this case, there were multiple licenses, but they picked Apache 2.0. And then an OR means there's possibly different license choices. So again, for Dojo, we want to use the BSD modified license. It's AFL, academic freedom license is actually not very restrictive, but it's a copyleft, so let's avoid that. This one's not a good choice in most people, the GPL 3.0, but it's there for demonstration, and so on. So these are basically the various components that are in this product, and actually the whole, we go to the product, you have, information about the product, your copyrights and so on, your notice, so this is kind of, this is where you would put you might have commercial attributions, we use somebody's software, that sort of thing, that's what you put in there. You're the owner, we don't have a detailed commercial license, but it would go there. And then this is, the hierarchy view, and this is a subcomponent table view. So the hierarchy view and the subcomponent table view are pretty much the same data. And the magic button is right here. So if I'm here at the, go back to this widget framework, basically run attribution, and it pops up a little different format. So this is just reading the database and coming up, and there's a different template just for fun. So what this is, again, you have your text at the top. Here's some language about commercial contract, and you can see here we have components, little higher level components, and in this case we have 5 big licenses, or 5. MIT is not a big one, but we put the licenses at the end. So, for instance, some people say BSD is only a paragraph. I'll just keep repeating it. Some people say let's put it at the end. But basically, once you have the components, their licenses, and their connection to the product, then the generation of the attribution is pretty simple. So this understates the work. It's an ongoing process. But once you have a set of components in here and you want to do a new release, you basically copy the prior release, most people, and say, here's my new components, and I can just have release X, release XY, release XZ, and so on. That's the idea. So it's the same idea, but done from a database of metadata instead of done from inside the engineering system itself. So it's the same kind of approach, and the key in both cases is I have an inventory in some way, right? And so you could sort of think of, summary detail. And I've got an inventory in the engineering code base itself, and I abstract out a level of detail for management reporting or the general ledger or whatever you want to call it, and that's what I put into a higher level system like Deja Code. So the point is, once you got the data and make a reasonable attempt to keep it up to date, if you have some basic tools, it can be as easy as pressing a button. Obviously, again, I don't want to underestimate that. You have to think ahead of what your templates are, all the things you're going to do, but that's actually. And that ran just in the time we were there. So if I go down a little further, just to show you a component. So now if I look at this component, I also can see the parents of where it's used. So some of these are in my product. It's also actually used in other open source projects. This whole thing is all network, right? All kinds of products have dependencies on other products. And then I would have notice information, the copyright information for this particular component, and a series of other items. And then here, these are our templates that your legal department would update, saying here's the basic requirements. You have to have the text in the source. You have to have the license text with documentation. No use in endorsements, which isn't usually a biggie. Most reputable companies wouldn't think of misusing someone else's name. Change tracking, okay, so that's an important one. An indemnity clause, again, people don't spend a lot of time on those, as we see, but it's important. OSI approved is interesting to know, and very importantly, you've got a patent grant. So basically, you put these components together, you have the data at the component level. If that component is used in 6 products or 1 product, you only have to do the work once, and you just have to say what I'm using in my product. So, questions or comments on that?
Any questions from the audience? Yeah. Well, that's great. Michael, any closing remarks?
Sure. Thank you. So, again, if you want to see more of this product, the URL is in the package, and we have a public site which doesn't show you the product functionality, but you can look at all the licenses and components. And if you ever want to go, if you value, you think our opinion on what the license is worthwhile, you can go find it. Most of our clients do. So that's one where you can see that publicly. And we're happy to engage on any of these topics with you directly. We have a scanning tool that we've been using internally that we're going to make open source in the next month. That's a whole different topic about how you get the data in. It's never as easy as people want it to be, but we're trying to help out there. So we're committed to helping people get there and, focus on practical ways to comply. And again, our experience is if you make a good attempt and you're consistent and diligent over time, you're not going to be the one in the crosshairs. Right. The open source community really is pretty happy to see people trying to comply, and that's what you need to focus on. And if you make a little mistake here and there, go correct it. But, it's actually a lot less impact usually than a software bug. So that would be kind of the message. I hope makes sense legally, too, but, that's what we see.
Excellent, and it absolutely does. Thank you, Michael, for joining us. I can say that my clients have expressed that they're getting significant return on investment in working with NextB and just streamlining these processes and automating them and coming up with systems that reduce the individual hours and resources necessary to develop a full and robust compliance program. So highly recommend talking to them. And thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. We're going to stick around here, and please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Michael if we can help in any way.
As a reminder to our webinar attendees, please be sure to sign and submit the sign-in sheet you received yesterday evening in order to receive MCLE credit. A recording of this program will be sent to all attendees within the next several days. Thank you for participating in this webinar.